use high-resolution surface scanning, and they also use a computed X-ray tomography to get closer looks on the inside.
The X-ray tomography clearly laid out what the gear trains, also a complete reading of basically all the surviving inscriptions on the device, both inside and out.
Scientists called it impossible, a 2,000-year-old computer that models the heavens, called the Antikythera Mechanism.
What if it wasn't made 2,000 years ago? What if it was made in the future and traveled back to the past?
But we didn't get the full story. Many of its gears were corroded and tossed aside as indecipherable.
Incredibly complex, and it took a long time for them to figure out what that even is.
Then, AI stepped in. It decoded them and proved everyone wrong.
The Antikythera Mechanism didn't just time travel. It is the time machine.
What it found inside wasn't just a lost invention. It was evidence that ancient Greece had mastered engineering on a modern level.
The Greeks were thinking really deeply about the universe, how it worked, what it means to have a universe that's in some way mechanical.
Cracking the bronze code inside the Antikythera. Picture a bronze box about the size of a shoebox, roughly 13 inches tall and 7 inches wide. Every inch of it is filled with tiny gears, each one hand-cut, stacked in layers, and locked behind thin plates covered in engraved Greek writing. This corroded little box, found in pieces inside an ancient shipwreck, is what remains of the Antikythera Mechanism, often called the world's first computer. What's left of it looks unimpressive. 82 fragments, only about 1/3 of the original device. 30 gears have survived, most of them fused together inside the largest piece, known as Fragment A. For almost 2,000 years, those fragments sat at the bottom of the sea, eaten by salt and time, until modern science finally found a way to look inside them without breaking them apart. That breakthrough came in the year 2005. A team of researchers hauled a massive 8-ton X-ray scanning machine all the way to Athens. Imagine a hospital CT scanner, but one built not for humans, for bronze. Each fragment of the mechanism was placed inside, one at a time, and blasted with high-energy X-rays from hundreds of angles. Those beams passed through the corrosion, allowing computers to rebuild the interior in ultra-thin layers, revealing gear teeth, shafts, and faint letters buried under centuries of crust. For the first time, scientists could peel away the damage and see what the ancient engineer had actually built. But the X-rays weren't the only trick. Another method, called reflectance transformation imaging, took hundreds of photographs of each piece under light coming from different directions. On a computer, researchers could move that light to make scratches and worn lettering suddenly appear. It was like shining a flashlight across a coin to catch the details that normal lighting hides. Using these two tools together, X-ray for the inside, reflectance for the outside, they doubled the amount of legible writing on the mechanism. What they found was not random scratches. It was a set of instructions, a user manual written 2,000 years ago in Greek, and that changed everything. Before this discovery, most historians thought the mechanism's front face was simple, maybe just a calendar showing the moon and the sun. But the newly uncovered text told a very different story. The inscriptions described a complete model of the known universe, a cosmos where the sun and all 5 visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each moved on its own track around Earth. It wasn't a decorative idea. The writing listed real astronomical data, how long each planet took to appear, disappear, or reverse direction in the sky. This inscription, now called the front cover text, is written like a guide for the user. It lists events such as stations and retrogrades, and even gives the number of days between them. To a casual eye, it might look like a checklist. But to an engineer, it's a clear statement of what the device had to calculate. To understand what the inscription means, you have to know what a synodic period is. It's the time it takes for a planet to return to the same position relative to the sun, as seen from Earth. Because both Earth and the planet move, this period isn't the same as a full orbit. It's the visible rhythm of that planet in our sky. Ancient astronomers could measure these cycles with the naked eye, and the Antikythera Mechanism's front dial was built to show exactly that, where each planet would be at any given time and when it would appear to move backward. The X-rays also revealed how much of the original front gearing was gone. Fragment A held 27 gears, while 3 others were scattered among other pieces. The planetary gears described by the inscriptions, however, were missing entirely. Most of that part of the mechanism had simply dissolved away. To many researchers, that might have seemed like freedom, a chance to imagine any kind of model they wanted. But the opposite was true. The combination of what the writing said, the shape of the surviving frame, and the math visible in the rear gears locked the possibilities into a narrow range. The front couldn't have looked like anything. It had to look and work in one specific way. To see how the designer thought, we looked to the back of the device. The upper spiral dial showed what's known as the Metonic cycle, 235 lunar months spread over 19 years. The lower spiral showed the Saros cycle, 223 lunar months, which predicts eclipses. And beside it sat a smaller dial that multiplied that number by 3, a correction system that accounted for the way eclipse times slowly drift over the centuries. These weren't mystical numbers. They were precise, repeatable relationships that could be represented perfectly by gears. And that's exactly what this machine did. But the most shocking revelation came not from the back, but from the writing on the front cover. In 2016, researchers re-examined the high-resolution scans and spotted 2 mysterious numbers, 462 and 442. They weren't page numbers, and they weren't random. They turned out to be the keys to the entire system, the exact mathematical relationships describing how long it takes for Venus and Saturn to repeat their patterns in the sky. For Venus, the inscription pointed to 462 cycles in 289 years. For Saturn, 442 cycles in 427 years. Those might sound like meaningless numbers, but to an ancient gear maker, they were perfect. Each number could be broken down into smaller factors, 2s, 3s, 7s, 11s, 13s, 17s, all manageable tooth counts for bronze gears. In simple terms, these numbers could be built, and that's the beauty of it. Those ratios weren't just accurate, they were practical. They told the builder exactly how to design a train of gears that would make each planet's pointer move correctly on the dial. But here's the twist. Planets don't move at steady speeds. They appear to speed up, slow down, and even move backward for a while before continuing on their way. Ancient astronomers called that retrograde motion. To mimic it mechanically, the designer used a clever trick called an epicycle, a small circle that rides around a larger one. In the Antikythera Mechanism, this effect was likely achieved through something modern engineers call a pin and slot design. One gear had a tiny pin on it, and another gear had a curved slot. As the pin moved along the slot, the driven gear would speed up and slow down, exactly matching the variable pace of the planets across the sky. This wasn't speculation. The same system was already proven to exist on the back of the mechanism, driving the moon's irregular motion. That section survived almost intact, showing how the ancient builder made the moon move slightly faster and slower depending on its position, a feature known as the moon's equation of center. Once that was confirmed, it became clear that the front probably used the same technique for the planets. When you combine that kind of motion with the long, accurate ratios described by the inscriptions, you get something extraordinary, a miniature universe running on bronze. The writing on the plates supports this interpretation perfectly. The back cover describes the front as a series of rings with a golden sun at the center, each ring carrying one of the moving bodies, the planets and the moon. Other inscriptions mention a star calendar that matched the zodiac, helping users identify when certain constellations rose or set. These details aren't decorative flourishes. They're the layout plan for the front of the mechanism itself. One common question is, why do we only see those ratios for Venus and Saturn? The answer is simple. The other sections of the plate were too damaged to read. But because the inscriptions were arranged systematically, it's clear that every planet probably had similar ratios. Another constraint the designer faced was space. The surviving fragments tell us how large the case was and how much room was left for gears. It wasn't much. The box was only about 3 inches deep, and the shafts for the pointers on the front had to fit one inside another, like the tubes of a telescope. That meant every gear had to stay under about 100 teeth to fit without colliding. Those two ratios, 462 and 442, worked perfectly within that limit. They made it possible to create a functioning planetary system inside a box that could sit on a table. The inscriptions told us what the front needed to calculate, the rhythm of the planets and their motion. But one setting on that front ring stayed hidden for years. Only when artificial intelligence stepped in did it finally reveal the truth. AI solves the mechanism's oldest mystery. For years, there was one puzzle no one could solve. Beneath the broken calendar ring on the front of the Antikythera mechanism lay a row of tiny holes, and nobody knew how many there were supposed to be. The ring itself was cracked, warped, and partly missing. Most people simply assumed there were 365 holes, one for every day of a solar year. It sounded neat. It felt logical. But neat isn't proof. The fragments don't lie, and the fragments weren't adding up. The problem needed more than guesses. It needed numbers, and a method that could read through centuries of damage. That breakthrough came in the year 2020. A small independent group led by Chris Budiselic, better known to millions online as ClickSpring, took on the challenge. Budiselic isn't a professor. He's a precision maker who builds mechanical reconstructions of the Antikythera mechanism by hand, cutting gears, just as the ancient engineers once did. Using the best tools available, he and his collaborators took high-resolution X-ray scans of a piece called Fragment C, the remaining arc of that calendar ring. Then, hole by hole, they marked the center of every punch mark they could still see. 81 holes survived across the broken slice. That was only a fragment of the full circle, but it was enough. Using simple geometry, the team mapped those 81 holes onto a perfect circle, corrected for the warping and fractures, and calculated what a complete ring would have looked like. The X-ray images they used had a resolution of about 50 micrometers. That's roughly 2/1000ths of an inch, meaning they could pinpoint each hole with astonishing accuracy. Their first results were cautious, but powerful. When they ran the numbers, they discovered that the full ring could have held anywhere between about 347 and 367 holes. In other words, a 365-hole design, the old assumption, was only one of many possible answers. It no longer looked certain. The group didn't push one theory over another. Instead, they released all their raw measurements publicly so that other researchers could test them. That openness set the stage for something remarkable. A few months later, two astronomers from the University of Glasgow decided to take the challenge further: Professor Graham Wone and researcher Joseph Bailey. Both came from a field that deals with incredibly faint and messy data, gravitational wave astronomy. They were used to spotting patterns buried deep in noise, and when they looked at the Antikythera ring problem, they realized it was exactly the kind of challenge they dealt with all the time. The question was simple. If the full ring once had n holes spaced evenly around the circle, which number n best fits the surviving 81 holes we can still see today? To answer that, they turned to a kind of statistical reasoning that also sits at the core of modern artificial intelligence: Bayesian inference. That might sound intimidating, but the concept is straightforward. It's a way of asking, given the data we actually have, which possibilities are most likely to be true? Then, as you test new possibilities, the model keeps updating how strongly it believes each one. You start with guesses, compare them with the real data, and gradually zero in on the options that fit best. Imagine you have a perfect metal ring with n evenly spaced holes punched into it. Now imagine that ring gets cracked, bent, and warped over time. Some holes are missing. Some have shifted slightly. You can simulate that damage mathematically. Tiny shifts here, small distortions there, and then ask, which original n would most likely lead to the hole positions we see today? The algorithm runs through hundreds of scenarios, comparing predictions against real measurements, and in the end, it produces a probability curve showing which n fits best. After running their analysis, the Glasgow team found something that shocked everyone. The most probable number wasn't 365 at all. It was around 355. Their detailed result came out to about 355.2, with a range of roughly plus or minus 1.5. That means the true value almost certainly lies between 354 and 356. When they slightly adjusted the dataset, removing holes that sat right next to deep cracks where the bronze might have shifted, the result barely changed. It settled at about 354.1, again with the same uncertainty range. In both cases, the evidence was overwhelming. The ring almost certainly had either 354 or 355 holes. A ring with 360 holes? Hundreds of times less likely. A ring with 365? Practically impossible. The conclusion quickly spread through the scientific press. The Antikythera calendar ring didn't mark a solar year, it marked a lunar one. The Greek lunar year was about 354 days long, almost exactly the number of holes found in the analysis. Unlike the solar year, which follows the sun's path and lasts about 365 days, the Greek lunar year was based on the moon's cycles. Each month began with the first visible crescent after the new moon, and 12 of those lunar months added up to roughly 354 days. To keep their seasons from drifting too far, the Greeks sometimes added an extra month, but the core of their calendar always followed the moon. That one change flipped the story of the entire mechanism. Why? Because this outer ring isn't just decoration. It's the date track that drives the whole front face. Each little hole is like a notch on a safe dial. A small pin would drop into a hole, locking the ring in place for one day. To advance the date, you'd lift the pin, rotate the ring one hole forward, and let it click into the next spot. The number of holes determines the rhythm of that daily movement. If the ring has 354 holes, then the entire system advances through a 354-day cycle, not a 365-day one. That changes everything. It means the mechanism was tracking time according to the phases of the moon, not the path of the sun. And because the ring sets the timing for the front gears, every pointer and planet display attached to it has to move in sync with that rhythm. You can't gear a planetary display for a solar year if your date ring only runs for a lunar year. The ring wins every time. It's the master clock. So where did those 81 visible holes come from if the ring is so badly broken? The answer lies in the imaging. Budiselik's group didn't guess. They used micro-CT scans that could see through the corrosion. Even where the bronze surface was pitted and irregular, the scans revealed tiny circular voids, the ghosts of the original punch marks. By tracing the centers of those voids and correcting for how the fragment had warped, they could reconstruct the spacing with incredible precision. So, the planetary gears have to turn according to the ratios described on the cover, but they also have to advance one step each day in time with a lunar-based calendar ring. That leaves almost no wiggle room for alternative layouts. The missing front gearing has to fit both rules. The ratios carved into the inscriptions and the pace set by this 354-day ring. So a small team got to work bringing it back to life. Building the ancient solar system. With that groundwork, a team from University College London built a working model in 2021 that finally made the system run in a believable way. The model doesn't just guess. It uses every scrap of physical evidence left on the fragments. And what it shows is beautiful. A set of tiny interlocking gear systems stacked like layers of a clock, each one controlling a moving ring on the front face. At the heart of this design is something called epicyclic gearing. That simply means one gear riding around another gear instead of staying fixed in place. Attached to those moving gears are small pin and slot devices. The biggest visible clue to all this sits right on the front. The large four-spoked wheel that turns the display. It's labeled B1 by researchers. When scientists scanned it with high-powered X-rays, they discovered 8 small pillars around its edge. 4 tall, 4 short, each with holes where pins once sat. Those little posts weren't decorations. They were anchor points for 2 thin bronze plates, a narrow strap mounted on the short pillars, and a wider circular plate resting on the tall ones. Between those 2 plates lay a dense stack of tiny moving gears, 9 layers squeezed into a space barely half an inch thick. Every millimeter of that setup tells us this was no ordinary wheel. It was the foundation for a compact planetary system. And that's where one of the most important surviving fragments enters the picture. Fragment D looks small, just a piece of corroded bronze with a gear stuck to it, but it turned out to be the smoking gun for the planet Venus. For decades, nobody knew what it belonged to. Early guesses said it might hold 2 gears, but detailed CT scans showed the truth. It's one 63-tooth gear riveted to a thin disc, both turning on a little axle in their own plate. That combination, gear plus disc, is exactly what you need for a pin and slot epicycle. And the tooth count of 63 isn't random either. It fits perfectly with the numbers the front cover text gives for Venus. When you factor that number into smaller primes, 3 times 7, you get values that match the ancient period relation for Venus, 289 synodic cycles completed in 462 years. In plain English, it's a neat buildable ratio that matches both the math and the metal. That's why the University College London team identified fragment D as the Venus gear train itself. Here's how it all moves in simple terms. The big wheel at the front, the one you'd turn by hand, rotates once for each passing year. At the center of it sits a smaller fixed gear. Around that fixed gear, another small gear orbits like a moon around a planet. A pin on that orbiting gear slides in a curved slot connected to a follower arm near the center. As the pin moves, the arm speeds up and slows down slightly, copying the way Venus appears to hurry and pause in the night sky. That delicate wobble is the heartbeat of the front display. The Venus setup isn't alone. Right beside it sits Mercury, built on the same principle, but even tinier. Mercury's system uses a pair of miniature gears, one with 40 teeth, one with 20, mounted directly into that narrow strap plate. Both Venus and Mercury share a central 51-tooth gear, cleverly saving space and metal. The reason this works is hidden in the ancient math. Both planets' orbital ratios share a common factor of 17. That means one fixed gear can serve both without throwing off their timing. This sort of efficiency wasn't random, it was planned. The original builder had a rule. No gear could have more than about 100 teeth, or it would simply be too big for the case. so the designer picked orbital numbers that broke neatly into smaller factors, numbers that were accurate for astronomy but also gear-friendly. The whole device balances between cosmic math and metalwork. Meanwhile, the machine also had to show the changing phases of the moon. To do that, the builder split the sun's motion into two versions: a mean sun, which moves at a steady rate, and a true sun, which accounts for the slight seasonal speeding up and slowing down. The mean sun output feeds into a small differential gear system that turns the black and white moon ball. By comparing how the sun and moon move, the ball shows each lunar phase: new moon, first quarter, full, and so on. The true sun drives its own separate display ring, keeping the face clean and organized. This kind of elegant divide-and-conquer design shows real engineering skill. Another small but vital part sits near the spoke labeled B there. Scans revealed a tiny bearing, evidence of a self-contained gear set that tracked the moon's orbital nodes. Those nodes are the 2 points where the moon's tilted orbit crosses the sun's path. The ancient Greeks pictured them as the head and tail of a dragon, the creature that devours the sun or moon during eclipses. On the Antikythera Mechanism, a slim pointer called the dragon hand moved slowly around the zodiac to show where eclipses were possible. The gears for that hand form another compact epicyclic unit, tucked between the main wheel and the strap plate, exactly where the surviving marks say they should be. Everything so far, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, and the lunar nodes, fits within the small gap between the big front wheel and the first plate. But there's another layer above that, between the strap and the circular plate, in a space barely 3/8 of an inch thick. The builder had to fit the rest of the solar system, the true sun, and the outer planets Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Here, the University College London model introduces what they call indirect epicyclic trains. Instead of one simple orbiting gear, each of these systems uses several small gears and another pin and slot device arranged off-center, producing the slow looping speed changes that those distant planets show in the sky. A single fixed 56-tooth gear sits at the center of this plate, serving all three outer planets. To save even more space, some gears are shared between the systems. Gear 52 connects the Sun and Saturn, and Gear 64 links Mars and Jupiter. Again, those shared parts aren't for show. They're possible because the planetary ratios themselves were chosen to share factors, just like the inner planets did. All those tiny gear trains, each for a different planet, had to deliver their motion to the visible rings on the front without crashing into one another. The only way to do that was to use nested tubes, each one thinner than the next, stacked around the central shaft like a telescope. Each tube carries its own ring, with engraved markings and a small bead or little sphere to mark the planet's position. The outermost rings belong to the outer planets, and the innermost carry the moon. The order matches ancient Greek cosmology exactly: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Those little spheres weren't random stones. In the Reconstruction, each planet's marker uses a semi-precious color mentioned in ancient descriptions: turquoise for Mercury, deep blue lapis for Venus, emerald for Mars, ruby for Jupiter, and sapphire for Saturn-Venus, and a golden bead for the Sun. The moon keeps its half-black, half-white ball, showing its changing light. So, when all of this comes together, every gear, plate, and pointer, the front of the Antikythera Mechanism, looks like a miniature bronze universe. In the very center sits Earth, surrounded by a half-black, half-white moon that turns to show its phases. Around it, slim concentric rings glide in silence: Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each marked by a small bead that drifts smoothly along engraved zodiac signs. The outermost ring carries the calendar days, clicking forward one hole at a time to the rhythm of a lunar year. And it raises one last, haunting question. If this level of design existed more than a century BC, who were the minds and hands that made it possible? Who had the theory, the tools, and the workshop culture to carve the heavens into bronze? The lost origins of the Antikythera Mechanism. The ship that carried the Antikythera Mechanism went down sometime in the 1st century BC, settling on the seafloor off a tiny Greek island named Antikythera. In 1900, sponge divers stumbled upon its remains: bronze statues, marble fragments, jars, coins, and, tucked among them, a lump of corroded metal that no one understood. Later excavations recovered more of the cargo, enough to date the wreck with confidence. The jars, known as amphorae, match types made around 80 to 70 BC, and coins lifted from the seabed in 1976 were minted between 76 and 67 BC. That range pins the sinking to roughly the middle decades of the 1st century BC, meaning the mechanism itself had already been designed, built, packed in a wooden case, and shipped by then. That timing matters. It places the machine squarely in the late Hellenistic world, a time when art, engineering, and astronomy blended more closely than ever before. The ship's cargo wasn't ordinary trade goods. It was filled with luxury, sculptures, ornate glassware, and fine metalwork bound for wealthy buyers farther west. Whoever ordered the mechanism was part of that elite class, someone with money, curiosity, and access to scholars who could read the stars. If we ask where such a thing could have been built, Rhodes stands at the top of the list. The island was famous in antiquity for its mix of science and craftsmanship. It had a thriving bronze industry and schools where astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers worked side by side. The Roman writer Cicero even described seeing a working orrery, a model of the heavens, made by Posidonius of Rhodes, a philosopher and scientist of the 1st century BC. Cicero said this machine could display the movements of the sun, moon, and the 5 known planets as they appeared in the real sky. That single note from history, built by our friend Posidonius, is remarkable. It shows that, right around the same time the Antikythera Mechanism was sailing across the Aegean, a Rhodian workshop could already build such a marvel. It doesn't prove that Posidonius made this exact device, but it puts the right skills in the right place at the right time. Still, the text on the mechanism's backplates hints that its intended user may have lived farther north. The names of months on the back dials line up not with Rhodian calendars, but with those used in Epirus and Corcyra, regions in northwestern Greece. That detail has led many to imagine a story like this. A Rhodian shop full of instrument makers and astronomers crafted the device for a client from the north, perhaps a scholar, priest, or statesman who wanted his own portable cosmos. The ship was carrying that machine home when it sank. It's an elegant theory, and it fits both the inscriptions and the trade routes of the time. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.